All right, everybody, we are back for section 9 of our research methods course, and today we're just going to have a short section all about using secondary data, i.e., somebody else recorded some data of some kind for some purpose, and now we're going to use their data to answer our own research questions. And this is a much more common, much more popular thing than you might think. Now, there's lots and lots and lots of secondary data out there, right? As I said on an earlier section, if you gather data and you use any government money to do it, you are legally required to submit your data after you're done using it to this group called the ICPSR, housed in the University of Michigan. So you can go there today. Anybody who wants to can go to the ICPSR website and find just data after data after data from all kinds of different sources, right? One of the most common is surveys, because surveys ask a ton of questions, and there's tons of surveys that are done all over the place, right? When I wrote my dissertation, I used secondary data analysis of a survey that somebody else had done. And luckily, they included enough information with their data set that I was able to kind of get all the information I needed to do my own analysis of their data. There's also official statistics, right? So, like the crime rate. The FBI compiles the Uniform Crime Report and makes that data available for free to anybody who wants to go to the FBI website and look it up. And you can take a look at how different crimes are rising and falling over time, or how they're different in different geographic areas or whatever. We might also want to look at, official statistics like the unemployment rate, either over time or in different geographic areas or whatever. Then there's official records, right? Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, all that kind of stuff are official records. And then there's historical documents, right? This might be diaries or letters or records or recordings from some period of history. Maybe, the Revolutionary War, or the Apollo program that I'm so interested in, or there's all kinds of documents that are saved from any major historical period or historical events that we can go look at either in museums or, just people have them lying around. Old editions of the newspaper are all over the place. You can find them online. You can find them in museums. You can find them in the archives of any given newspaper office that's still around, right? Once we get any of this secondary data, we can do a lot of different things with it. We can do a comparative analysis, right? So maybe we're interested in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So we're going to find old copies of the newspaper from both the North and the South and compare how newspapers covered the event in northern states like, New York and Pennsylvania, and then compare that to how it was covered in southern newspapers from, say, Georgia and Texas and Alabama, and see how that same event was very different in the eyes of these two very different groups that had just finished or was just finishing this war between those two groups, right? We can also do a content analysis, right? And that content analysis, maybe we're interested in how often different newspapers use the word terrorism or terrorist to describe different crimes, right? So, say school shootings. We look back at newspaper articles from different newspapers for different school shootings, and we want to do a content analysis of how often they're calling people who walk into schools with a gun and start shooting people, how often do they use the word terrorist or terrorism, right? That's a content analysis. One of the things that's kind of unique or special in criminal justice, my own field, is crime mapping, right? So we've got all these reports of different kinds of crimes, whether it's calls from 911 or arrest records compiled by police or whatever. And we want to know what parts of our city have the most reports or incidences of assault. And we can take a map of the city and kind of put a pin either physically into a physical map or virtually using a computer, and map out where we're seeing lots of incidences of assault, especially assault with alcohol involved. And we can look at both geographically and then, of course, over time to see where these crimes happen. And from the hours of 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., assaults involving alcohol rise sharply in this particular neighborhood. So let's send some more patrol cars to that neighborhood to try to deter that kind of activity, right? So we can use these maps, both geographic and time-based, to figure out what kinds of crime are happening, where exactly those crimes are happening, find those hot spots that we can then kind of target and hopefully reduce those specific crimes or at those specific times, right? So with secondary data, step one, we want to identify a population of documents. Maybe it's newspaper articles, maybe it's diaries from Civil War soldiers, maybe it's birth records from 1800 to 1900 or something like that. Then we're going to determine our units of analysis. Is it issues of the newspaper? Is it particular articles? Is it, days in the diary, or is it just the diary itself, right? So we want to determine our units of analysis. What is our one thing that we're sampling? Because it might be newspaper companies, it might be daily editions of each newspaper, it might be newspaper articles, it might be newspaper authors, writers, right? But we're going to have to determine what our unit of analysis is depending on our research question and all that. Once we've determined our unit of analysis and our population, we draw our sample using the sampling methods we discussed in an earlier section. Then we're going to design our coding procedure, right? We're going to read through this article and write down every time they use the word terrorism or terrorist or act of terror. Then we're going to test it, right? We're going to take everybody who's going to be doing the marking. It might just be us, but we might have a team with us, maybe some graduate students, maybe some people we hired, fellow researchers, who knows. And we're going to go through and we're going to make sure that everybody's getting kind of the same result. And maybe we forgot to include this other term that's very related to that we want to include, but we forgot to include it at the beginning. So now we're going to change our coding procedure to include that term. Then we actually, do the coding and go through all the newspaper articles or all the diaries or all the birth records or death records or whatever, and code it how we, or mark every time we see that word, or classify that article as positive or negative, or classify that birth as category A or category B or category C or whatever. And then finally, once we've done all that, we can then do our analysis, right? We can figure out whether some newspapers or newspapers from a certain region of the country are more likely to use the word terrorist or terrorism than others, or kind of whatever our actual research question is, we can figure it out and actually do our measuring and our analysis and try to get some answer to our research question. Now, there are some issues involved with using secondary data, right? Because you weren't the one that gathered that data. You weren't the one that compiled all that information. The FBI's Uniform Crime Report, you didn't call all those different police agencies and say, hey, how many of this crime did you have reported? How many of that crime did you have reported? And their process might not meet your standards. It might have had a different purpose to it. And all of that can affect what data was collected, what data wasn't collected, how data is coded in the particular thing, right? So all of these issues listed on this slide can have problems and introduce problems into you trying to do your analysis of this data that somebody else gathered, right? So when I was doing my dissertation, I had to look up exactly who gathered the original data. Why did they do it? Is it the first time they've done this? Are they experienced? Do they have their code books there that explicitly define exactly what each variable means, and inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, exactly what dates they gathered data, beginning this date, ending this date, that kind of thing? Because all of that can have an effect on how you do your analysis and how appropriate it is for you to be able to use to answer your research question, right? So if the people I gathered my data from defined, say, cyber criminal very differently than I was defining cyber criminal, maybe their measure of how many cyber criminals there are is very different than the measure would have been if I had gathered that data, if I had performed that survey, right? But luckily, the survey I used was from a very experienced group. They had tons of documentation available, so I was able to read all about, exactly how questions were worded and exactly kind of what happened and when and how and what, the survey takers used a laptop computer rather than being asked questions by a human being, and so, all of that stuff really had an effect on exactly how I shaped my research and how my research came out, and kind of what conclusions I was able to draw. But all that information is incredibly important. And if you can't answer any of these questions, you might want to skip that source. You might not want to use that data in your own analysis because, maybe they were not necessarily an unbiased researcher. Maybe they had some ulterior motive, right? Maybe it wasn't actual doctors doing this study about lung cancer. Maybe it was financed by a tobacco company, and thus their data isn't really the most trustworthy. And even though your particular research question isn't necessarily about lung cancer, their, let's say, modification or interpretations of exactly how they marked down certain variables or recorded certain information or didn't record certain information might absolutely affect your desire to want to use their data to get an accurate representation of this other lung issue that has nothing to do with cancer, but it still might have been affected by the purpose or the motivation behind gathering that initial data, right? Now, just because we're using secondary data doesn't mean we don't have to be careful about confidentiality, right? So if we're able to look at this historical piece of information, this, some archive from 50, 60, 100 years ago, where clearly everybody involved is dead, if we're able to kind of figure out enough using either that source plus modern information or modern techniques, or this source plus some other sources from the time, we are still under ethical obligation to maintain any confidentiality that those original researchers promised. So if the original data was collected by somebody promising confidentiality, we are ethically obligated to maintain that confidentiality, even if we could theoretically violate it, and even if those people are long dead. Because there's still their descendants to worry about. There's still kind of impacts for what that might mean for different organizations and groups and their grandson, great-great-grandson, whatever, like all those people might still be affected by this kind of breach in the confidentiality of these historical figures, right? Especially when dealing with things like crime. We also have to worry about cultural issues, right? So different cultures have different rules about all kinds of different, records and all of this data has different cultural impact for different groups, right? So we have to be careful of things like identifying infidelity or a birth with a parent of one race and another parent of a different race. Because in some cultures, these are seen very differently than they are, say, in our culture, right? Some cultures see things more harshly than others. Some cultures have cultural norms that are very that are varied, right? So I know in some cultures, if a person loses a spouse, they're expected to be in mourning for 1 year. And after that 1 year, they're expected to not be mourning anymore. And then at that point, they can go and do, start dating again and start doing social things again. So if we get information that this person went to a party on a certain date, we have to be careful about disclosing that, because maybe that means that they were going to this party only 9 months after their spouse had passed, and that's a big deal in their culture, right? So we have to kind of understand these cultural issues, try to avoid being insensitive, try to avoid a situation in which people are harmed by the norms of their culture, not necessarily you as the researcher and your culture. Even if your culture says something is perfectly acceptable and who cares, doesn't necessarily mean their culture does. So we have to be kind of cognizant of that and careful of that. All right, this was a really short section. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you in the next one.